started as a very good example of not using all your time at all. So I think we could even start now with if anyone has questions to Dirk, and we actually have quite a lot of time until the next speaker. Okay, and those of you who spoke, if you could mention your name and your affiliation or institution where you come from.
Who has the microphone?
And I have another question. I mean, if you had been giving this talk in the middle of the 16th century, when the world was swamped by books for the first time, there was a huge amount of information swimming around, what would you have changed to your talk?
Okay, so maybe let's start with the second part of it. Yeah, we are overwhelmed with information, and that's a reason why now companies come up with recommender system. That in itself is not a bad thing. What is really important, however, is that people have control over these systems. That means that we can turn them on and can turn them off, that it's not just oriented at what the average person is interested in. I would like to know what I would be interested in. So we need to have a multidimensional reputation system. I need to be able to decide myself what kind of information filter I want to use. It shouldn't be given by a company. I want to have a set of filters to look at the world in different ways. I want to have the final word. And that's also important for our whole approach. You're saying, okay, who's deciding about values, for example? We believe it should not be decided by a few people or a few companies. People should decide it, and that's why we promote this bottom-up approach, the participatory approach that FuturICT stands for. And it's very logical, because as our systems are becoming more complex, decentralization is a logical step. So we have, however, to solve the problem how to make sure that there's not a big mess resulting from everybody just taking decisions completely independently from each other. If we want to have a coordinated situation still in our society, then we need to think about the interactions in the system. Interactions determine the outcome. And also, the principles oriented at which we're orienting this should be decided bottom up. Other questions?
Other questions?
I have many more slides, 150 more slides to show you. Please go ahead.
I guess while people are thinking, I mean, one question I could ask is of course, as a quantitatively oriented social scientist, one is always concerned about data quality and different kinds of biases and so on that can make you draw incorrect inferences and so on. Have you had time already now to think about how this kind of data collection efforts is going to provide a truthful picture of whatever it is that you're studying? And it would be interesting if you could just elaborate a little bit on the data collection side.
As much as possible, we would like to have an open platform. Wikipedia is very much based on openness, although there's some structure in the background, obviously. So we would certainly have a similar approach. What is needed from our point of view is a rating and reputation system that would allow people to give feedback on the trustfulness and quality of data and so on. We certainly also need to give detailed information, who created the data, and all these kind of things. I mean, identify the sources. But these kinds of platforms that allow user feedback can be created, and actually some of them are available, and we will be interacting with centers for social data, of course, to make sure all of that is integrated. We're not reinventing the wheel.
Yes.
Marcus Sergius with Academy of the Humanities and Social Sciences. I would like to know, how do you intend, or how do you want to include now the qualitative sociology and humanities? What is this example about the social footprint, or how does it work exactly to include these two branches?
Okay, yeah. So, social footprint. We are trying to measure, for example, at the moment, social well-being, happiness with data that are available through Google Trends and other services. We're correlating this with experimental data in the World Value Survey to make sure that the new indices that we are creating from those big data sets are meaningful and consistent with what social sciences have done before. This study is in progress, and we think that it may make a contribution actually to coming up with better indices for social well-being. There was this committee that Nicolas Sarkozy has established with many Nobel Prize winners on board that looked for a follow-up index of the GDP per capita, considering environmental issues, health issues, educational issues, and so on. So it's very expensive to get the data in a classical way. If we could get similarly good data from data mining, that would be very useful. And I believe we still need to have the combination of these different methods. So not one method will replace the other, but they will mutually benefit each other. We'll get a better picture if we combine those different methods. I'd also like to show you actually one activity that's being done by Maximilian Schich, who is going to visit us very soon. And he's looking actually at artifacts. And what he's starting with is a taxonomy of artifacts, actually of all kinds. And then he's creating an accurate picture of the interactions between documents, monuments, events, persons, locations, time, and so on. And it creates quite complicated network structures that, however, allow you to get a better picture of how culture evolves over time, and you can identify missing links. You can maybe identify sources of inspiration of an artist from these kind of data. So these are activities that are bringing qualitative and quantitative sciences together. Semantic networks have a really huge benefit, I would say, also for language. We now have automated translation services of Google. It cannot be done by translating it word by word, but you need to consider the context, the correlations between words, and the context is changing the meaning. So that only becomes really possible to do the translation with big data as Google can assess it. So there are new possibilities coming up through big data, and that are very interesting, I think, for all fields of sciences. And we're very open for interaction with people from all fields.
I think there was one.
Big data, of course, most of the big data is in the hands of companies. Think of Google, Facebook, Walmart, etc., etc. And on the other hand, of course, you want to have your independent data sources and data quality assessment. How do you see the link between FuturICT as a more scientific-oriented project vis-à-vis corporate world out there that's really charging ahead?
Okay, also here, the principle of FuturICT is to create interfaces for interaction. I'm just trying to find the picture. Interfaces is really important. In particular to business and policy, but also to other projects. like we have interfaces to the FuturICT project or to the future computer, future internet. So in particular, what you're going to create is this platform, and this can be imagined as an app store, basically, where people can make their own contributions of data and models. So not only the partners of this project are going to create models and come up with new data sets, but also maybe a programmer in India and somebody in South America who has a data set to contribute will be open. People will be able to earn something on the data set if they like. And we want to create something like an innovation ecosystem, actually, that is going to spark off new activities, economic activities, but also non-governmental activities, new creative activities. So it's really important to recognize that we're creating a new acre on which people can put seeds, which can grow on this platform. Just trying to find a picture. So it's very important to recognize that innovation is not a linear process. It's an ecosystem that requires many different players. And in particular, it requires fundamental research, pioneers. It requires mainstream research. It requires applied research. It requires interaction with business. So it requires theoretical work and experimental work, data mining experts, and a lot of different approaches in order to create this rich forest, rainforest kind of innovation ecosystem in which new things can happen.
Heinz?
Carsten Donner, ETH. Just a very practical question. As a young researcher, you mentioned that there might be new positions coming up. It will contribute to PhD research. Could you elaborate on that?
All right, so we expect in the first stage of FuturICT, which is called now the ramp-up phase, and it extends over 2.5 years, there will be about 100 teams of scientists all over Europe who are involved. And in those teams, there will be typically 1 or 2 positions to fill. And so that's quite a lot of positions, actually, all over Europe. Then there's also matching funds of the same order of magnitude that further increases number of positions. And I've seen over the past months is that there was an enormous interest of people to collaborate with us, to do work in this area. Some people are even changing fields because they think this is a really important project. They want to make a contribution to addressing global challenges, even if it's a small contribution, but people are very motivated. And actually most experts who have been working with us have done it for free. So motivation, inspiration is really what is driving this project.
So we have one speaker here.
I'm Heinz Kutscher from the Swiss Academies of Arts and Sciences. Understanding the emergence of phenomena in this complex, strongly coupled world is one really big challenge. But doesn't it call for real intervention? I mean, you showed us the example with the cars where you inserted a type of electronic device so it worked afterwards. That's not that easy with humans. So do you have a specific theory or a couple of tools, a toolbox of intervention? Because let's think of an example of a very violent herding. Let's think about the Rwanda 15 years ago. If they would have tweeters, what would have happened? I mean, how can you intervene in such situations? And the question, of course, is, I don't want to hear from you, it's just information. You have to give information away to people, because we know from environmental psychology and all this stuff, it's not really working just like that. So perhaps you can elaborate on that a little bit.
Okay, so certainly not going to produce ready-made solutions over here, but also when you're talking about conflict, it's very important to recognize that conflict is a result of something, in particular different preferences. And there are actually models that give a picture of what are conditions under which conflict would result, and under which, for example, social norms would emerge in contrast. Now, one of the questions is, can you transform one of these systems into another one, into a more peaceful one? And there's actually quite some interesting results that indicate that kind of conflicts often result from different ethnical backgrounds. I mean, there's a genetical inheritance mechanism that plays a role over here. And genetic inheritance has been probably the first mechanism that allowed cooperation to happen in societies. But it works in a way that different populations drift away from each other. Today's modern societies are based on different principles. We don't have anymore the family structure in the middle of our societal organization, like the clan, basically. That's the clan structure tends to create this conflict. Rather, we have found new mechanisms to support cooperation in our society, such as repeated interactions, for example, and indirect reciprocity, that means reputation-based mechanisms. So there is social innovation that has allowed us to overcome sources of conflict. And this is about the approach that I imagine. I could certainly talk also more about this example of Jerusalem, for example, where we have these data that show you that there is a retaliation dynamics going on. So it's a system in which one event responds to other previous events. Once we understand this, it could be put, as we've done it, into a simulation model. And this simulation model can be used to assess different scenarios that are under political discussion, to give hints what would be scenarios that would likely create more violence or less violence. So, in fact, it turns out that there are a number of scenarios that would reduce violence as compared to business as usual. And that is something that could actually turn out to be quite helpful. Then we're also thinking a lot about financial systems or network systems in more general. And there are certain insights about principles to make these systems less vulnerable. And here's one slide that's summarizing this a little bit. So redundancy helps in many cases. Having reserves, limiting the size or interconnectedness, or having instead an adaptive decoupling. Diversity can help actually to stabilize the system. But if you look into details, then it turns out that the network structure matters a lot. So there is no simple solution that works best for every system. And so depending on the network structure, there are different strategies that turn out to work best. In this case, we're talking about disaster response strategies. But we do have some ideas, and we have some plans how to create further knowledge along these lines.
I think we have time for probably two more questions. And here, first.
I'm Dieter Imboden from the Swiss National Science Foundation. I mean, your program is very complex and has different facets, sides to it. One is apparently doing research, but I'm under the impression you also have something like a a social plan or a political plan how you want to change the world. And now the question is, what is the long-term outcome of such a project? I mean, you're building up an infrastructure, maybe comparable to the infrastructure at CERN, but on the other hand, it's an infrastructure with a strong social component, and the question is, once this project is over or the finances are over, in what direction would it go? Would it become a private company like a super Google? Would it go into the same direction as most of these projects to become commercialized? Do you have any ideas about the long-term outcome of that?
We think that this should actually be in the hands of the people, I mean, the societies, and that's why also this project should be done by the European Commission as compared to a company, when certainly a company like Google could do the project in itself. But it would be less interested in privacy respecting issues, in value-sensitive ICT and these things that are of societal value and importance, but there's not enough economic incentives to drive these things forward. That's why it requires a public effort to create a public good, and maybe it's even a mistake that the European Union doesn't have a company like Google, you know, that. So it's certainly not very healthy if there are private companies that know so much more than politicians. Just let's give one example: the EHEC spreading. At the time when this disease was spreading and people were dying, I was talking to those colleagues who are doing the disease spreading models. And we made some progress in reconstructing the dynamics and hope to identify the source of the spreading. It was clear to us that the cucumbers were not the problem and these kind of things. We finally, however, couldn't solve the problem because we didn't have the logistics data of the vegetable flows. So it would have been good if these data would have been publicly available, because then we could have contributed to overcoming this problem earlier. Yeah, and see, the overall policy approach is sketched over here. So it's not a computer that would determine the best solution that then would be implemented. Rather, it's an instrument to look at difficult problems from different perspectives, and everybody could do it. That means interested citizens could do it to make up their mind. And in the end, decisions will have to be taken based on priorities and values, as we're doing it today, and it will ever be like this.
Okay, person in the middle.
Vera Nordniska from two questions. First question: are you expecting any concrete results for economic sciences or for finance research or anything of this kind? For example, development of new indicators or new means of calculation, new means of estimation and comparison. And the second question: we have been witnessing very speedy technological development of communication means over the last 10 years. And the impression is that the research methods are just lagging behind the new technological advancement. How are you going to deal with this? Because essentially every day new means of technology appear. How it will be integrated in your research and data mining? Thank you.
Yeah, this is a very important question. In fact, technology is running away at an extreme speed, one should say. And we believe it's not enough if the social sciences pick up the subject with a certain delay. Social sciences should be involved when these ideas and technologies are born, when decisions need to be taken, whether a certain technology should be pursued or not. And there are a lot of ethical considerations that come into play over here, as we have had an ethical debate about genetics and cloning and so on. We need to have an ethical debate about big data and information communication technologies and how society wants to use them. This is very important, but this project is offering this opportunity that social scientists are there at the moment when these new technologies are born by the ICT people within the project. We have a close interaction between the people. And of course, we expect that there will be new understandings of our economy and the financial crisis in particular and how it resulted, and how the financial architecture could be modified in a way that would make it more resilient to internal or external shocks. Just to give one example, we have seen a huge cascading effect that had a global impact and maybe hasn't been stopped yet. And that shouldn't have happened. If economists had anticipated that such a cascading effect could happen, that there would be bubbles and crashes. But mainstream economics doesn't foresee these things to happen. But if it would have been foreseen, there should have been preparations to stop it. There should have been firewalls basically in the system that would stop the cascades. Engineers know how to create networks in a way that can stop cascading effects. So if economists and engineers and other scientists sit together, as Trichet also has suggested, then we believe we'll come up with better solutions, in fact.
Okay, I'm afraid I think we're going to have to end at that point and thank Dirk for a very, very interesting presentation.